There are Pokemon out there that have some special requirements in their care. Maybe it's a specialized diet, or possibly a specialized environment, or even a special kind of training that's exclusive to that Pokemon line. These requirements are usually a hurdle, an obstacle that needs to be considered when caring for these Pokemon, but they can usually be overcome through clever solutions and hard work. And then, after that, it's fairly simple to care for the rest of the Pokemon's needs. I say this because I have never seen the amount of special care requirements on one Pokemon species that the Zubat line has. Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through and look at what it would take to care for and raise a Pokemon in your own home. Today, we'll be going over the Zubat line, which obviously includes Zubats and its following evolution. Zubat itself is actually fairly small, being only 2.5 feet in length and weighing 16 pounds. These Pokemon strangely don't have eyes, instead relying on their massive blue and purple ears to listen and echolocate their way through their environment. They also have two small thin tails instead of legs, and a pair of purple and blue wings that keep them aloft. Lastly, they have a wide mouth that has 4 rather sharp fangs situated inside it. Upon evolving, Golbat keeps the same general body plan but gets much bigger, standing 5 feet tall and averaging around 120 pounds. And yes, I said standing, as this Pokemon now has 2 feet that it can use to walk along the ground. Its ears have also shrunken down and it has eyes now, being less reliant on its echolocation. The final evolution, Crobat, actually changes up the body plan quite a bit, now being a sharp purple in color and evolving a second pair of wings that aided in aerial maneuvering. Unfortunately, these wings hinder its ability to traverse the land, hence it's evolving tiny little feet that are really only good for hanging from branches and cave ceilings. It also gets a bit bigger than Golbat, now standing 6 feet tall from wingtip to wingtip, and weighing 165 pounds on average. In all, they don't seem that complicated. After all, they don't have an open flame coming out of their body, or have a plant on their back that needs to be taken care of as well as the Pokemon. But don't be fooled. These might be the most specialized Pokemon we've covered in the series so far. And if you're the kind of person that likes a challenge like that, then please, keep listening to see if these Pokemon could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. And so, we get started right away with those special requirements. And instead of going right into how to set up the enclosure for these guys, we're instead going to talk about the other Pokemon that need to be housed with them. Just like Pikachu, Zubat and the rest of their line are very social animals, but they need specifically other Zubat evolutions around them. It's a major part of their biology that they form these large colonies and all flit and fly together. That's why Repel sells so well when it's near a cave that has a Zubat population. Because the colonies of these Pokemon are so dense that you won't be able to go 5 feet after defeating one Zubat without running into another one. These Pokemon need that kind of socialization with each other to stay healthy, both physically and mentally. So, if you're going to care for your Zubat correctly, then you're going to have a lot of Zubat. In all, you'll need at least a dozen of them if you want to form a healthy colony. Now, if that were just for Zubat, then that wouldn't be bad. They are pretty small after all. However, if you plan on having Golbat or Crobat, then you'll need a lot of space for them. But you also don't need all of one evolution. So you can mix and match Zubat, Golbat, and Crobats to your heart's content. It's just a matter of you'll need more than one. So that's how we're going to be talking about things in the rest of this guide. Now, for how the enclosure should be built, this isn't going to be like the other flying types that we've covered. While yes, they do fly, and that is an important part of their health and exercise, they're actually more used to confined spaces, like caves or the under canopy of a thick forest. This means that, unlike Pidgey and Spearow, they don't actually need to be let out of their enclosure as long as the enclosure itself is big enough to accommodate their entire colony. So you don't have to worry about having to let your whole colony out to fly and then worry about them attacking people and Pokemon for food, the fact of which we'll cover later. But this does mean that we'll need to build a much larger enclosure for these Pokemon than we did for the other flying types that we've covered already. Size-wise, a good rule of thumb for the indoor part of the enclosure is that the length of the wall should be 15 times the size of the wingspan of the largest bat you have in your enclosure. So if you just plan on having Zubats, whose wingspans are usually in the 3-foot range, then you'll be needing an enclosure that is 45 feet length and widthwise. If you're only going to be going up to a Golbat, then you'll need walls that actually get up to 90 feet in length, as the average Golbat has a wingspan of 6 feet. And if you plan on having a Crobat, I hope you have a lot of space, because they have a wingspan of 10 feet, meaning you'll be getting an enclosure that's 150 feet in length and width. And when we talk about height, that's also a variation among the species, as the larger evolutions clearly need more space to fly around. In order from first evolution to final evolution, you'll need enclosures that are 10 feet high, 15 feet high, or 20 feet high. And this is all to give your Pokemon space. We haven't even talked about how it's supposed to be decorated yet. One big thing to consider with the decorations is that these Pokemon are nocturnal, meaning they sleep during the day and go out and hunt at night. Not only that, but with Zubat specifically, daylight can actually make them unhealthy, even burning their skin if exposed to it for too long. This means that you have to essentially daylight-proof their enclosure. How you do this is really up to how you decide to build the enclosure. If you decide to go with chain link walls and ceiling, then you can have a daylight blocking tarp installed over top of the fencing, thus stopping sunlight from effectively getting through. This could be the way to go because it's cheaper, but the tarp could also become problematic, as there's the possibility of it ripping or of it trapping in the heat from the sun. Another way to do this would be to actually build the full building. Yes, this ends up becoming more expensive, but you will be able to control the temperature much easier, and the light can be handled with light bulbs. Personally, I prefer the building method, as it's a decent investment if you plan on having these Pokemon with you long term. That's exactly what I've done with my own Spheal and Tynamo enclosures, as it's just so much easier to deal with. But again, it is more expensive, so I get it if that turns you off the building option. When talking about what should go in the enclosure, a big thing that you should be working towards is trying to recreate as much of the Pokemon's natural habitat as possible. This could mean that you'll need some fake trees that they can roost in, maybe some rocky outcroppings in the walls, things that'll make them feel safe and at home. Also, when putting these decorations in, you should consider the fact that the way these Pokemon sleep and socialize is by hanging upside down by their feet. So you'll need to provide plenty of space for them to do so, whether it be in the branches of a fake tree or off pegs and bars that come out of the wall. You could also add in some toys for them to interact with. The best ones would be the things that hang from the ceiling or other places in the enclosure. Be sure that these toys can handle the weight of the later evolutions, as the way that they'll be interacting with them will be flying up and landing on them most of the time. This also means that you'll want to avoid getting toys that their wings or feet could end up getting caught in. Lastly, water should be supplied in multiple dishes placed on multiple different shelves at multiple different heights throughout the entire enclosure. The same should be done with food, though the shelves for these should be left empty, which I'll explain later on in the care section. This is to help eliminate some competition that could arise between individual Pokemon over these resources. Moving on to other Pokemon that could be housed with the Zubat line, clearly other Zubat lines are a yes. It's necessary that they form a colony. This whole guide is assuming that you're going to be getting on a minimum of at least a dozen individuals. But as for other Pokemon being housed with them, I'm gonna say no on that. For a few reasons. Like I said earlier, these Pokemon are nocturnal, and their enclosure is built to avoid exposing them to the harsh rays of the sun. This is going to drastically limit the number and kinds of Pokemon that you can put in there with them. Most grass and fire types are going to be out. Really, anything that isn't a dark, cave-dwelling Pokemon shouldn't even be considered. Plus, any Pokemon that you do place in the enclosure with your colony runs the risk of getting swarmed and fed on by your colony. Not for the meat, but for their blood. Yeah, the Zubat line drinks the blood of its prey, meaning that any Pokemon you keep in there with them is going to be considered a snack. And I'm sure you're thinking of just getting a rock or steel-type Pokemon, something with a hard enough exterior that your Golbat or Zubat won't be able to drink its blood. Well, that won't stop them from trying. It's a well-known fact that these Pokemon often lose teeth because they try to drink the blood of hard-skinned Pokemon. So, putting them together is just going to lead to your Pokemon hurting themselves. It's best to just keep only Zubat line Pokemon in the enclosure and keep other Pokemon out. Availability. There's a running joke online that the creation and sale of Repel was made exclusively because of Zubats in caves and forests. And you know what? I can see it. Zubat and Golbat are incredibly common, to the point that if you traveled to the known caves and forests where they're spotted at night, you would have a near 100% chance of finding one of them. It's crazy, and the only region without a natural population of Zubat is the Paldea region. The only member of this evolutionary line that might give you some trouble to find in the wild is Crobat, but even then, they aren't too hard to find. Just remember, if you plan on going out and catching these Pokemon, you will need to catch at least a dozen of them to form a healthy colony. And be sure to bring some Pokemon with you to defend yourself. One Zubat on its own is usually no threat, but you won't find just one on its own. You're more likely to be swarmed by the whole colony. Getting swarmed by dozens upon dozens of Zubats, let alone the more dangerous Golbat and Crobats, can turn into a bad situation pretty quick. Remember that your safety is worth more than any Pokemon you could ever catch. Funny enough, despite how common they are in the wild, in the breeding circuit they aren't that common. Partly because of how easy they are to catch in the wild, but also because of the challenges in keeping them. With the specialized blood diet of these Pokemon, the nocturnal nature of them, and the need for such a large and enclosed space, many breeders just don't see it as an investment worth taking. When you could buy a dozen Pokeballs, head to the nearest cave, and catch all the bats you want. So, unfortunately for those of you who don't want to go spelunking in a cave and just want a breeder-raised Pokemon, then finding one is going to take a lot of work. It might honestly be cheaper to hire a professional trainer and have them go out and catch the Pokemon for you. Care. Feeding these guys is going to require you to have a strong stomach, because once again, they drink blood. Which means that you're going to have to handle and give them blood. So if you're squeamish or have a weak stomach, then I really suggest you look at getting a different Pokemon. As for how to get the blood, well, you could order it online. Yes, I know how that sounds, me telling you to order bags of blood online. But there are companies out there that collect, treat, and sell them. They are totally legitimate, but you may just need to get a license from your government to be able to buy it yourself. And for those of you out there thinking it, no, you shouldn't go out and collect your own blood. You're not trained to do that. The blood needs to be treated with certain substances and chemicals, and it takes a trained professional to collect it without hurting the Pokemon it's being collected from. It could very easily lead to serious injury. As well, the companies that collect and sell the Pokemon do so from carefully raised and monitored Pokemon, usually farm Pokemon like Tauros. This means the blood will be of the right quality for your Zubat evolution to get all the nutrients they need, and it means that the blood itself is usually disease-free. Blood is a great way for many diseases to spread, so just getting it from any random Pokemon you find could be a great way to expose your Pokemon and yourself to a very bad disease. Luckily, the Zubat line has a very strong immune system, but it's still not a risk you should be taking. When you order your blood, they'll come in thick bags and should be immediately refrigerated. Always keep an eye on the blood to make sure that it isn't going bad, and if it does, then you need to get rid of it in a biohazard approved container. When you go to feed your Pokemon, remove the needed amount of blood from your refrigerator. It can be kind of hard to gauge how much blood you need and what Pokemon is getting the needed amount, as they're all in the same enclosure, but a good rule of thumb should be 3 ounces of blood per Zubat, 10 ounces of blood per Golbat, and 15 ounces of blood per Crobat. It can be a lot. I mean, the average human body only has 160 ounces of blood, so if you have more than 10 Crobat in your enclosure, then you'll be feeding them an entire person's worth of blood. So be prepared for that. When you feed them, you'll be leaving the blood in the bags. This is because of the feeding method they use. See, this Pokemon's fangs are actually hollow, so when they bite down on their prey, their fangs puncture through the skin and they're able to suck the blood up through those hollow tubes, functioning kind of like a straw. But for this feeding method to work, you can't just put the blood out there in a dish or a bowl. The Pokemon need to be able to puncture something. By leaving the blood in the bags, you're offering that skin-like resistance when they bite through the bag, allowing them to feed naturally. When placing the bags, you'll want to put them out at sunset, right when the Pokemon are becoming more active. You'll be placing the bags on the different feeding shelves that I mentioned in the enclosure section. Then, throughout the night, your Pokemon will feed on the bags, draining them and emptying out their fill. Then, when sunrise comes around, as the Pokemon are settling down and getting ready to sleep for the day, you enter the enclosure and remove all the bags, even if they're still half full, and dispose of them. You do not want to leave old blood out, as that can cause infection and disease to spread. Also, if you enter the enclosure and see that some of your Golbat are bloated and having trouble flying, don't worry about it. It just means they got a little too enthusiastic when feeding and drank too much blood to fly. They should metabolize it fast enough to be able to get up to a perch pretty quickly. Or you could help them up if they're used to you by then. Which brings us to the next point of you interacting with your Pokemon. I'm assuming you don't want to buy a dozen Pokemon and build them a massive enclosure just to never interact with them. But the thing is that these Pokemon will never be super cuddly Pokemon. At most, they may land on you or allow you to hold them, though for the latter evolutions that may be hard considering how heavy they are. But you can still reach a point of positive relationship between yourself and the colony. This will mostly be by sticking to a schedule with feeding and cleaning, as this will allow them to anticipate when you'll be entering the enclosure. If they know that you'll be coming into the enclosure at sunset, put food down, hang out in a specific spot for some time, then leave and come back near dawn to collect the empty bags and clean up the enclosure, they'll be more comfortable with you and around you than you just popping into the enclosure whenever you want. This familiarity, along with avoiding any negative interactions with any of the Pokemon, will lead to them forming a trusting bond with you over time. This will, in turn, allow you to interact with your Pokemon more closely, having them land on you for support or allowing you to hold them. Just be aware that before that point, they might see you as another food source. So before you develop the relationship with these Pokemon, and maybe even after that point, I would recommend getting some rather thick protective gear for yourself, something full body, like what comb bee farmers wear. This will prevent you from becoming a snack for your entire colony, which will end badly. The last thing to go over is the cleaning. Seeing as how you're keeping over a dozen Pokemon in one enclosure, things are going to get messy when it comes to waste. It'll be a nearly daily thing that you'll have to enter these Pokemon's enclosure and scrape and scrub all the waste that these Pokemon make. As well, they aren't always the cleanest of eaters, so you could end up with pools of spilled blood to clean up. In my opinion, the best time to do all of this is in the morning, when you pull out the empty feeding bags. That way, it's nice and clean for the day and you don't have to worry about it when you go to bed. But really, it's up to you, so long as you keep a consistent schedule when you do it. Cost. Let's be honest here. It's going to be a lot. In every category. The Pokemon themselves are going to be in the high category. If you were able to just have one, then no, I'd say it'll be in the very low category. But the fact that you need to catch a dozen of them, which means at least a dozen Pokeballs, if not more, because they might break out of them, puts them clearly in the high category. And if you're going after the older evolutions, then you'll need either more Pokeballs or the higher quality ones. It's gonna be a lot of money simply because it's gonna be a lot of Pokemon. As well, their enclosure is gonna be in the very high category. You'll need to build an entire building just to house them. Add in all the decorations, the feeding shelves, the toys, and there is simply no way for this to be in any other category besides the very high one. And it's all because they need to have so many of their fellows in there with them. Don't think that food is where you're going to be getting off easy here either. Thanks to what they eat, even just buying food for one Zubat evolution could be expensive. They pass on the cost of the labor and the chemicals to the buyer, but the fact that you have to buy enough to feed at least a dozen of them means that just getting enough food to feed your Pokemon for a week is going to put you deep in the very high category. There's simply no way around just how much these Pokemon are going to cost. Conclusion. I'm honestly astounded by how difficult these Pokemon turned out to be. After all, they're so common in the wild that you don't really think about what it takes to actually house and keep some. I honestly think that the part that makes these Pokemon so tough to keep is the need for them to have so many of their fellow Pokemon around them. If it was just one Crobat or Zubat, then I think it would be a lot more manageable. But thanks to that, it makes housing and feeding them extremely impractical. This might be the first Pokemon that we've covered so far that I would have to say would be too impractical for anyone but zoos to house. But if you have the finances, space, persistence, and deep love of the Zubat line, then these might be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening in, and please join us again next time when we talk about the wandering weed Pokemon Oddish and its evolutions. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Evolution is a tricky thing to understand, and there are many questions that we still have about it. Why did some Pokemon evolve when others don't? Why don't humans evolve? Why are there so many different ways for a Pokemon to evolve? Despite all these questions we still have, there's no argument that it can lead to massive changes in a Pokemon's biology. It can add or take away types, switch around abilities, or even add or take away limbs. My scientist friend Dan actually did a paper on this phenomenon where he explored the genetics of Pokemon that can and can't evolve. It's an interesting read, but I don't remember what his conclusion was on the matter. And a very good example of these extreme biological changes is the Oddish line. Hello and welcome everyone to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how to care and raise different Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be going over the dual grass poison types that are part of the Oddish line. Oddish itself is a small 1.5 foot tall bipedal Pokemon. Its body itself consists of a blue round center that functions as both head and torso, a theme that the rest of the line share. It has small red eyes, a small mouth, and 2 short legs that sprout from the bottom of the head torso. On top of its head are 3 broad green leaves. Upon evolving into a Gloom, it keeps the same general body shape, but the green leaves have now turned brown, and situated in the top of the head is a bulbous red flower. It also grows arms and lips, strangely. A Gloom stands at 2.5 feet tall and weighs an average of 19 pounds. After this second stage, the Pokemon does evolve again, but it's strange because there are actually 2 different evolutions that can take place based on what stone they're exposed to. The most common final evolution to see is Vileplume, which is what you get when you expose a Gloom to a leaf stone. It grows in size, now standing about 4 feet tall and weighing 41 pounds. It still has the same body shape with the blue head torso with limbs, but the flower that has started to bloom on its head now takes over the entirety of Vileplume's head, even overhanging the edges of it by a good distance. However, the other and much more rare evolution of Gloom comes when it gets exposed to a sunstone, which doesn't happen often. Couple that with the fact that it shares very little in common appearance-wise with its previous evolutions, and you can see why it took scientists some time to figure out that Bellossom was part of the Oddish line. Bellossom doesn't have the same blue head-torso body of the others in its line, instead having a green body, with a head, chest, and arms. I'm not sure about them having feet, since they have a skirt made of grass leaves that surrounds their lower body at all times. There is a rumor that they actually don't have feet, and instead use the grass skirt itself like tentacle legs, which I find more fascinating, but a lot less cute. The flower that was on Bloom's head now has changed and split into 2 small red flowers that sit on either side of Bellossom's head. Funny enough, this is also one of the rare occasions where the final evolution actually gets smaller, with Bellossom being only an average height of 1 foot 4 inches and weighing 13 pounds. At least Bellossom smells better than Gloom does, and doesn't have toxic pollen like Vileplume. But we can get more into that later on in the guide. For now, let's go through and see if the Weed Pokemon line are actually the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. The really nice part about these Pokemon is that their enclosure for the most part is really simple. They simply need an open patch of grassland. You see, Oddish itself is nocturnal, burying itself in the soil during the day. This is where it gets most of its nutrients, as it's thought that its feet turn into roots when it does this. And then, at night, it'll uproot itself and wander up to 1,000 feet in search of more nutrients and to spread its seeds. Mind, that's not 1,000 feet away or in a straight line, it's just covering 1,000 feet. They often have a very meandering and looping path, so you don't need an enclosure that's 1,000 feet by 1,000 feet. Really, I'd say that as long as it's 1,000 feet square, you should be good. So it should be roughly 100 by 50 feet, which, yes, is a large amount of space, but not nearly as bad as it could be. And the best part is that it just needs to be a grassy field. You don't have to put much into their enclosure at all. The most you'll have to do is enclose it so that your Pokemon doesn't wander off. So you may have to install a chain link fence to keep your Pokemon in, but really it's nothing more than a big yard. In a rare twist on the usual, Gloom actually needs less space than Oddish. This is mostly due to its feeding style. Oddish absorbs nutrients from the ground, meaning that they need to constantly wander about to find fresh nutrient-rich soil. Gloom, however, changes into an ambush insectivore. They attract bug-type Pokemon to them using the scent coming off their nectar and flower, and then, when the bug Pokemon gets close enough, they strike out and consume the bug Pokemon. This hunting style means that they don't actually move around or use a lot of room. So realistically, if you want, you could downsize the enclosure to 50 by 50 feet, still giving it plenty of room to move, but also allowing you to possibly save money on the enclosure. Moving on to the final evolutions, they don't actually change that much from Gloom. Vileplume still uses the same ambush tactics to eat bug-type Pokemon, so you don't need to change the proportions of the enclosure for that at all. The only thing you'll need to make sure to do is that there are no obstructions in the yard that their petals can get stuck or caught on, as that flower is much bigger than the one on Gloom's head. And when talking about Blossom, its feeding style changes once again. See, Blossom comes about when a Gloom comes into contact with a Sunstone, and Sunstones are generally found in more tropical areas of the world. And what's more abundant than anything in tropical areas? Sunshine. So Blossom has evolved from the ambush tactics that Gloom developed to a more plant-like photosynthesis feeding method. They simply need a large amount of sunshine every day to be able to keep themselves healthy. Mind, this doesn't mean that they don't need space to move around. Blossom is known for wandering beaches and jungles and dancing when happy. So any enclosure that they have will need to have at least a bit of space for them. All this is to say that you don't need to change the enclosure size for Blossom either. But since they photosynthesize, they will need some spaces that don't have any obstructions to the sunlight. One interesting thing to mention about Blossom is that you could technically train it to live inside your home with you. I wouldn't recommend that with any of the other evolutions, as Oddish needs to bury itself during the day, and Gloom reeks terribly to most people, and Vileplume's flower is just so big it doesn't fit well in most homes. But Blossom is small, smaller than most of the others in its evolution line, and has a friendly and non-destructive manner, making them great candidates for living in your home. If you would like to do this, then the main things to keep in mind is that your Pokemon will need plenty of time outside to get the sunshine that they need, and they will need space to move and dance, as they're wont to do. As these Pokemon are grass-type Pokemon, I should also mention that they don't do well in cold weather. If the ground freezes, then Oddish can have a hard time either pulling itself from the ground at night or digging into a new spot in the morning. As well, the cold temperatures can cause the flower petals on Gloom's, Vileplume's, and Blossom's heads to wither and become brown, which can be a major health risk for these Pokemon. So, if you happen to live in a colder region of the world, then I'm sorry, but these Pokemon might not be the best choice for you. The last thing to keep in mind when thinking of these Pokemon should be the ones that could be housed with them. After all, you'll be keeping them in your yard pretty much, so if you happen to have any other Pokemon, it's likely they'll come into contact. The first thing is that they can do well together with their own kind, but with certain specifications. If you have a lot of Oddish, then you'll need to make sure that the soil nutrients stay high, as they'll all be feeding off it at the same time. As well, with Gloom and Vileplume, they'll be competing with each other for their food. Blossom is really the only one that can be housed together without much need for supervision or your intervention. Fire-type Pokemon are a clear no-go, which should be obvious with the grass typing of this line. As well, flying-type Pokemon would be a bad idea, especially with Oddish and Blossom, as they're small and can make easy prey for some of the larger predatory flying types. And you should avoid any Pokemon that are grazers, meaning that they just roam around and munch on grass all day. They may try to eat Oddish's leaves, Gloom and Vileplume's flowers, and Blossom's grass skirt, And if that happens, you'll either end up with a bite out of your Oddish line Pokemon, or a battle that may not end well for either Pokemon involved. Bug types are also not going to be a great idea either. They'll munch on Bellossom, and Gloom and Vileplume will snack on them if they're small enough. Funny enough, Oddish might be a good match for some bug Pokemon, as its poison typing gives it some protection from bug types. But if you want to do that, I would only do small carnivorous ones. That way they don't try to munch on Oddish during the day. It's a lot of rules, since grass types have so many weaknesses. But as long as you follow them, then you should be good with other Pokemon. Availability. These Pokemon are generally very available. There are wild populations in all but 2 regions, those 2 being Alola and Paldea. And while they aren't available throughout the entire regions that they are present in, the areas that they are wild, they are by no means hard to find. Thanks to their diversity in feeding styles and the fact that a few of them have developed defense strategies, they've been very successful in creating large populations wherever they live. The only exception to this is the final stone evolutions. Both Vileplume and Bellossom are very rare in the wild, due to the scarcity of the stones they need to evolve. Encountering a leaf stone in the wild is not something that happens often. But they aren't rarer than moonstones, so if you are patient and know the right places to look, then you might be able to find a Vileplume in the wild. The same goes for Bellossom. Now, Bellossom is much, much more rare. It's more common for sunstones to occur in tropical places, which of course makes you think of Alola, but as we've already established, there is no native Oddish population in Alola. And most other regions don't have the correct climate to form sunstones. Hoenn is close, and maybe Johto, but it means that the odds of a Gloom coming into contact with a sunstone and becoming a Bellossom in the wild is very small. When talking about the breeding industry, then things get a bit odd. Sorry, I had to make that joke at some point in this guide. See, if you're looking for an Oddish, then you'll have no problems finding it at all. Running an Oddish farm is relatively simple. You just need quite a bit of space and to fertilize the soil to make sure that it stays nutritious enough for them. That level of ease means that there are people all around that have Oddish farms. But Oddish is really the only one that'll be easy to find in the breeding circuit. Gloom, let's be honest, the limiting factor is the smell. A breeder putting up with the smell is a lot to ask, and because of that stench, you aren't going to be selling many of them. Yeah, there are people out there that do like the smell, but they are few and far between. Breeders just won't be making a profit. And this shortage of Gloom breeders leads to a shortage in the final stages. That, and the price of the stones makes these Pokemon uncommon to find for sale. So, if you want an Oddish, then I would highly suggest getting one from a breeder. But if you're looking for one of the final evolutions, then I would say that your best bet is going out and catching one. Which isn't bad because they aren't terribly dangerous as long as you have a Pokemon of your own to keep you safe. Care. Food's gonna be strange. Mostly because you don't really need to provide them food. Unlike the Bulbasaur line, which acts more animal than plant, these Pokemon are more plant than animal. And much like plants, you don't really need to provide them food like berries, as they kind of provide for themselves. Take Oddish for example. When it's buried in the soil during the day, it's actually feeding itself by absorbing the nutrients from the soil. So you don't need to feed it anything. What you'll have to do instead is make sure that the soil is in good condition for them and keep it nutritious. Since you're keeping your Oddish in an enclosed space, it's going to be feeding in the same spots over and over again. This is going to drain the nutrients from the soil over a period of time, leaving it somewhat nutrient barren and unable to feed your Pokemon. What you'll have to do is get in the habit of checking and reinvigorating the soil. They have machines that can help you with this, but the kind of balance in the soil you're looking for is slightly acidic. Not overly much, just a pH of 6 or so, but it's enough for your oddish to thrive on. You'll also want it to be a loose, well-draining soil. The looseness will allow your oddish to dig in rather easily when day comes, and the well-draining part will allow them to still get their water without the ground being a mud hole. If you notice that your yard doesn't naturally have the right conditions, or your oddish has started to drain the soil from feeding, then you can add things to the soil to bring it back up to snuff. Things like fertilizer and some rotting vegetation can do wonders to help reinvigorize your dirt and allow your oddish to be able to feed in that section again. When moving on to Gloom and Vileplume, they pretty much have the same feeding style and requirements as each other. Those requirements being that you don't really have to do much at all. Like I said in the Enclosure section, Gloom and Vileplume's flowers and bodies produce nectar and scents that attract bug Pokemon to it. Unfortunately, that is an unavoidable part of these Pokemon's biology, given that the flowers are part of their bodies. While this does mean that you won't have to consciously go out and feed these Pokemon, it does mean that they'll be attracting and eating live prey. I totally get it if that makes you uncomfortable. It does for many people. And I'm sure there are some out there that are wondering why they can't just feed their Gloom or Vileplume bug Pokemon meat, like I've done for other meat-eating Pokemon that we've covered. The thing is that you can, but they'll still attract those bug Pokemon to them. That'll lead to a situation where they either eat the meat you give them and then have a bug Pokemon problem on your hands because they're not eating them, or they end up eating the live prey anyway and don't eat the meat you give them. So unless you're planning on enclosing the entire enclosure like a greenhouse, which would be ridiculously expensive, then your Pokemon possibly eating live prey is something that you'll have to deal with. Lastly is Bellossom, who is easiest out of the four of them. The majority of Bellossom's diet is going to be sunlight. Those flowers on their heads and the leaves that make up their skirt photosynthesize the sunlight and produce almost enough nutrients for the Pokemon to survive on all by themselves. Almost. Bellossom is still an animal, and the plants on its body aren't enough to keep it going normally. I mean, it's not a Sunflora after all. So you'll have to give it a meal of berries once a day, about 2/3 of a cup. It can be a mix of any berries you want, but I would stick with the fruit that grows in tropical regions. Things like the Mancos, the Wiki, and the Nanab berries, as those are the berries that they're most likely to eat when they're in the wild. Combine that with plenty of time outside in the sunshine, and you'll have a Bellossom that grows happy and healthy. And that's mostly it for these Pokemon. Really, they're a very hands-off line, so there isn't much in the care section to talk about. Though there are a few smaller things, like how if you have a Gloom and you don't like the smell that it gives off, it would be best to spend time with it and form a close bond with it. I know, that sounds counterproductive, but the fact is that the more relaxed and comfortable the Gloom feels, then the less intense the smell gets. Even to the point where, according to a few accounts I found, the Pokemon is so relaxed that it'll emit no scent at all. So dealing with the smell for a little bit early on can make it so that you don't have to deal with the smell at all later. Also, speaking of bonding with these Pokemon, it's pretty easy to form a bond with Bellossom thanks to its proclivity to dance. They'll dance just on their own throughout the day, but if you put on music for them, they'll be much happier and dance more energetically because of it. And should you join in on the dancing, well, your Pokemon will just be over the moon happy just because you're sharing one of its favorite pastimes. It's not a major thing, since a strong bond isn't necessary for these Pokemon to be great household Pokemon, but it's still something that I think you should explore. A strong bond with your Pokemon can make your lives so much better. Cost. Enclosure-wise, you're probably looking at the high category, and that's simply because you have to fence in such a large area of land for your Pokemon. But there is still a range of how much this can cost you. The cheapest option would be a wood fence, but you can also spend more money to get a chain link fence, or any other material you'd like. You can also save money by installing the fence yourself, or you can save time by hiring a company to come in and put the fence up for you. But again, either way, you're gonna be in the high category. The food price will actually vary depending on what evolution you currently have. Oddish might be the most expensive one with the fertilizer, and even then, it'll be in the low or maybe even the moderate categories depending on what brand you get. It could be even cheaper if you decide to buy it in bulk. Bellossom will be in the low category as well. With the small amount of fruit you give them per day, it's almost a negligent cost. Just pick some up when you go to the grocery store. And then Gloom and Vileplume catch their own food. So it's nothing, which I guess is technically in the very low category. In all, this line is not very expensive to feed whatsoever. Again, with the Pokemon itself, the price will fluctuate depending on which one you want. If you want an Oddish, then it's going to be in the very low category, whether you get a breeder one or a wild one. Gloom, however, while still in the very low category from the wild, will be more expensive if you get one from a breeder. Really, the only advantage to a breeder-raised one is that it'll be more comfortable around you right away, and stink way less because of it. If that means a lot to you, then a breeder-raised Gloom will probably be in the low to moderate categories. And then, the final evolutions will be in the high or very high categories, simply because the price of the stones will be added on top of the breeder's price. I guess they could be in the low category if you manage to find one in the wild, but the chances of that are slim, and you'd need more advanced Pokeballs for that to be reliable, so it's probably going to cost you more even from the wild. Conclusion. You know, I never expected that the two grass types that we've covered so far would be the ones to make the best pets. I mean, Bellossom is about as easy as it gets. Sure, there are some downsides. Oddish is nocturnal, Gloom stinks, and the final evolutions need stones, but even still, to me, that doesn't outweigh the benefits of these Pokemon. They're easy to get a hold of, easy to care for, easy to interact with. If you have a busy life and don't have much time to spend taking care of a Pokemon, or just want a Pokemon species that can really take care of itself without much interference from you, then I would highly recommend any of the Oddish evolutions. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again for the next episode where we cover the mushroom bug Pokemon Paris and its evolution Parasect. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Alright, let's get this out of the way now. It's not a parasitic mushroom. It's symbiotic. The Pokemon gives advantages to the mushroom, and the mushroom gives advantages to the Pokemon. This is a give and take relationship. It's symbiotic. Okay? Okay. Now, for those of you that were confused by that opening, hello and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides. Today, we'll be covering the Pokemon Paris and its evolution Parasect. Now, the reason for that opening is that there is a consistent myth that surrounds these Pokemon from way back when it was first discovered. That being that the mushrooms on the back of this Pokemon are in fact parasitic and do harm to the Pokemon. It was thought that the mushrooms actually drain nutrients from the Pokemon, and, in the case of Parasect, even take control and force it to do the mushroom's bidding. That is not the case. The mushrooms, while they do drain some nutrients from the Pokemon, in return, the Pokemon gains the grass typing, allowing it to access a wider pool of moves and protection. So, as long as we all recognize that, let's continue. Paris itself is a small, foot-tall, 12-pound bug Pokemon. It has an orange body with 4 small back legs and 2 large front legs that it uses as weapons. Its mouth is pretty much a hole surrounded by sharp teeth, and it has 2 large eyes. And, of course, there are the 2 red and yellow mushrooms that sit on its back. When evolving, Parasect keeps the same overall body plan, but now it only has 1 big mushroom on its back instead of 2. Its eyes have also changed to be small and completely white, lacking a pupil. A lot of people actually use this as a sign that the mushroom is parasitic and has taken over the Pokemon's body, but that's just not true. While the relationship between Pokemon and mushroom has become more intertwined, with the mushroom now being integrated directly into the Pokemon's nervous system, it's not to the point of the mushroom taking control of the Pokemon. The eyes have simply developed from complex sight organs to simple light detection organs. Parasect uses them to sense whether it's daytime or nighttime out. Oh, and Parasect also gets much bigger, now standing 3 feet tall and weighing 65 pounds. All in all, a complex blend of biology and symbiosis. But is its care just as complex? Well, we'll have to find out and see if these Pokemon are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. I think that this is a good place to mention that these Pokemon are considered pests and bad for the environment. Well, I mean, not bad for the environment, but if they end up overpopulating, then they can be a problem. See, these Pokemon feed on the roots of trees and other big plants, which, if their numbers don't get out of control, can be good. Clear out some older trees to allow new ones to grow, circle of life and all that. But if they start breeding out of control, then that can lead to them wiping out whole swaths of forest, which can be detrimental to the environment. All this is to say that raising and keeping these Pokemon as pets is gonna get you a few looks. And the enclosure needs to be built so that your Pokemon doesn't get out and start causing problems for the local environment. So we're looking at another Sandshrew-esque enclosure with a large enclosed building. I would recommend a greenhouse-style building, allowing natural light to come in. But when you do so, you'll have to tint the glass a little. Some light is needed for these Pokemon, don't get me wrong, but too much direct sunlight will lead to a bad growth for the mushrooms. If you tint the windows slightly, then it will help to limit the amount of light that reaches the Pokemon. Size-wise, it's hard to say. Like I said, these Pokemon are considered pests, so people don't really raise them. There isn't a guide anywhere that I can see that has territory numbers or needed space for either of the evolutions. So this is gonna really be me guessing on enclosure size. Judging by how their lifestyle is to wander until they find food and then dig into the soil to get at the roots of a plant, I'm going to say that they'll need a bit of room to move and explore. As well, since they do dig somewhat, you want to have a layer of dirt that they can dig into without escaping the enclosure itself. So dimension-wise for Paris, I'm going to say that you'll need something that's at least 25 foot by 25 foot length and width-wise. Then, I'll say you need at least 5 feet of dirt, along with another 10 feet of vertical height on top of that, so 15 foot walls in total. In all, not terribly big. For Parasect though, you are going to want to double the length and width, as well as double the dirt. So you're looking at a building of 50 feet by 50 feet and then 20 foot walls. Kinda big, but not the biggest enclosure we've ever talked about. And then on the one side of the building, you'll want to put a door that is watertight. This way you're able to enter the enclosure. And the reason it needs to be watertight is because of the humidity. Yes, because of the fungus that grows in the back of these Pokemon, it's going to have to be humid in this enclosure. And I'm talking about 80 to 90% humidity. You're going to walk into this enclosure and immediately begin sweating. But that's what's needed for the mushrooms to grow and remain healthy, which in turn helps the Pokemon remain healthy. And since you're going to need humidity, you're going to need heat. The inside of this enclosure should remain between 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or 21 to 26 degrees Celsius if you're not from Unova. To achieve this, you'll need to either install a conventional heating system like central air or space heaters. And remember to always protect your Pokemon from getting too close to what's giving off the heat and getting burnt from them. These Pokemon are very weak to fire after all. The last thing you should consider when putting together an enclosure for your Paris-type evolution is the decor. Some of it is going to be climbing spots. While these Pokemon do spend much of their time on or even under the ground, they do spend some of their time climbing trees and other tall structures. So 1 or 2 logs that are artfully placed around the enclosure at angles should provide plenty of good climbing perches. Combine that with a few bushes and a layer of grass, and that should be a good enclosure setup. Mind that all of these bits except the grass should be fake. Real logs will begin to rot and crumble in the high humidity, leading to eventual collapse and possible injury for your Pokemon. As well, real bushes will just end up becoming food for the Pokemon as it eats away at the roots. But luckily, the grass should be fine, at least in spots where the Pokemon doesn't dig into it anyway. As for other Pokemon that can live with this Pokemon, it's really not much. Never put any of the Morlo line in with them. They have a vicious rivalry with each other, and if put inside an enclosure like this, then it won't end well. As well, you should avoid fire, flying, ice, and really anything that's predatory or herbivorous, now that I'm thinking about it. Any of those things are dangers to your Paris evolution and should be avoided. You should also avoid grass types as they can sometimes fall prey to your Paris evolution themselves. So that really only leaves non-predatory water and normal types that can survive in the same environment. Not many, honestly. Though the good news is that you can house them with each other. I found no evidence of them being territorial or preying on members of their own species, so that's at least a plus. And also keep in mind that the enclosure that I've detailed here is just for one Pokemon. If you plan on adding any others, then you'll need to change and adjust things as necessary. Availability. Thanks to the specific environment needs of this Pokemon, they are very spotty in the wild, and it's hard for them to spread to a new environment. They don't even have a wild population in the Paldea, Galar, and Hoenn regions. And in some regions that don't have a great place for them, like Kanto, they've adapted to living in caves like Mount Moon instead of forests. Not to mention that since they're considered pests, people tend to get rid of them when they appear in a place they aren't wanted. There used to be reports of a wild population in the Unova region, but they haven't been seen in a while, so there's some speculation that the population got wiped out. Luckily, if you are able to get to a place where they live, they aren't usually hard to find. They tend to have a large population in those areas, so they shouldn't be too hard to catch. In all, if you want a wild one, then you are going to probably have to travel for one if you don't live near the territory already. Just always be sure to bring your own Pokemon with you for protection, as wild Pokemon, no matter the type or size, can be dangerous. When we're talking about the breeding industry, it's gonna be a big no. Like I said, these guys are pests to a lot of people, and they just aren't that popular among trainers. That lack of popularity and bad reputation means that they don't sell well, and breeders won't raise what doesn't sell very well. Trying to find a breeder that even has one of these Pokemon for you to buy will be a major effort. I'm not saying that they aren't out there. I'm sure you could find a bug collector or trainer that's willing to sell or trade you one, but that's probably going to be your only option if you don't want a wild one. Care. A big part of this Pokemon's care is going to be habitat maintenance. For example, one of the major things that you'll have to do is make sure that the humidity remains where it needs to be. As time goes on, unless you live in a naturally humid environment, the humidity will begin to drop in the enclosure. This means that you'll need to add it back in. The best way to do this that I've found is 2 methods mixed together. One is a simple water dish. This won't be used for drinking, which we'll discuss when we get to the food, but a water dish placed in the corner of the enclosure will slowly evaporate in the heat, increasing the humidity. Another way that you can increase the humidity is by using a spray bottle and misting down the walls. This will then evaporate just like the water in the water dish. The two of these things combined should provide plenty of water in the air. Remember that we're aiming for a humidity level of 80 to 90%, so to keep track of it, you'll need to get a monitor that can tell you the humidity of the enclosure. You can also get one that functions as a thermometer, so it can also help you keep track of that. You should check on these at least once a day. If the humidity starts to drop, then add in some more water to the environment. If it gets too high, then you should hold off on spraying any more water and possibly even remove the water dish from the enclosure for a few days, until the level reaches an acceptable range again. If the humidity remains out of these ranges, then it can cause the mushrooms to begin to wilt, leading to health problems for the Pokemon itself, so this can be a very important part of this Pokemon's care. Food is a slight problem. See, the reason that these Pokemon are considered pests are because they feed on the sap and nutrients in the roots of other plants and trees. And they don't just feed on a little, they feed on a lot, leading to the usual death of the plant. And that leads to a problem when considering how to feed these Pokemon. After all, you can't just let them free to feed on the plants nearby. You'd be releasing a pest on the land, and good luck getting them back. But you also can't grow plants in the enclosure itself, as the Pokemon will just eat it before it can grow to an adequate size. Plus, waiting for plants to grow means that your Pokemon is going to be without food while it's growing. So we need another solution. My first instinct was to say that you could use a store-bought nectar to feed these Pokemon, but upon further inspection, that appears to be mostly sugar and water mixed together, which doesn't hold the nutritional value that these Pokemon need. So, for the first time in this series, I'm gonna have to recommend that you end up going with store-bought bug food instead of trying to find something more natural. Plenty of stores have manufactured, kibble-like food that can be made specifically for Pokemon of a specific type. Grabbing a bag of bug grass Pokemon food should be pretty easy, but we won't be just feeding that straight to your Pokemon. Paras and Parasect don't just munch on food when they feed, they suck the nutrients out of roots, and you'll have to simulate that for them to be able to feed. This means that you'll be feeding them from one of those water dispensers that hang from the wall. You know, the ones that look like an upside-down water bottle with a metal straw at the bottom. That should provide a decent replacement for the roots that they suck on. For the food to be able to come out of the dispenser, you'll also need to liquefy it for your Pokemon. This can be done by leaving the store-bought food soaking in water until it becomes soft, and then blending it until it's a nice smooth liquid. If it's still clumpy or chunky, then add some more water before placing it in the dispenser. Once the dispenser is full, you can hang it from the wall or even one of the fake logs that are in the environment. Your Pokemon should be able to smell the food and figure out how to feed on it pretty quickly. As for the amount, it's kind of up in the air. So few people take care of these Pokemon that I've found almost no information about how much these Pokemon eat in a given day. So it's really going to be a run of trial and error. If your Pokemon eats all the food, then the next day you should make more. If they don't eat it all, then make a bit less. Eventually, you will be able to zero in on the correct amount that you should be giving them. The last thing that we should talk about is the ways that you can interact with these Pokemon. Really, it's not much. These Pokemon are not cuddly, friendly types. While they may not be actively aggressive if they know you, don't expect to be playing with them. They really just care about feeding and surviving. As well, staying inside of this Pokemon's enclosure could be bad for your health. Not only is the humidity extremely high, possibly leading to breathing problems if you're in it for too long, but the mushrooms on these Pokemon's backs release spores as well. Breathing them in for too long without medical attention means that you could end up with a fungal infection in your lungs, which is about as bad as it sounds. All of this means that your interactions with these Pokemon are going to be very limited, mostly contained to when you are maintaining the humidity and feeding times. These Pokemon are going to be more showpieces than pets. Cost. The Pokemon is going to be cheap, but like I said in the availability, they are definitely going to be hard to get a hold of. It's going to have to be wild caught, since, like I said, there aren't any in the breeding industry that I could find. That means that the price could be anything from very low if you live in or near a wild population already, or it could end up being more depending on how far you have to travel to get it. Just always remember to be careful when catching wild Pokemon. They can react unexpectedly, and the Pokemon that you're aiming to catch isn't the only Pokemon in that area. Always bring a Pokemon of your own, and preferably another person with their own Pokemon as well. Safety is #1 concern. The Enclosure is a fairly involved thing that you'll need to spend quite a bit of money on. Between the greenhouse building, the decorations, and the heating system, you're looking at probably the upper end of the high category. Not the most expensive of enclosures, but whenever you're looking at getting a full building, it's gonna be quite expensive. When looking at food, it's not gonna be too bad. Store-bought food, though I don't like giving it to many Pokemon, I will say that it's cheap and super effective. To get a 40-pound bag of food, you won't be spending more than the low category, and that's for the expensive food. And then, I would recommend that you get a separate blender for that as well. Nobody likes to get Pokemon food in their next smoothie. But overall, you shouldn't have to spend a major amount on these Pokemon. Conclusion. I think that these Pokemon are best left as curiosities and not pets. It's not just the fact that their enclosure is so specific and needs so much maintenance per day, it's the fact that they really don't make good pets. They don't interact with you, they can't really be trained, and all they really care about is feeding. If you do decide to get these Pokemon, the most you can do is watch them through the glass. Which I'm sure there are people out there that will enjoy that, but you will need to make sure you're that kind of person before getting these Pokemon. But I will say, they do have some positives, such as cheap food and easy care overall. So if you're looking for a Pokemon that only needs maintenance and daily small care, then these may be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for tuning in, and please join us next time when we go over the puffy purple Pokemon Venonat and its evolution Venomoth. Have a wonderful day, everyone. I'm not really sure why the Kanto Pokedex is so poison type heavy. I mean, we're only 19 species in, and we've already covered, what, 6, 7 different species that have the poison typing? And it's not like the region is overly developed. I mean, it's nothing like my home region of Unova. But nevertheless, there is a ton of poison Pokemon present in the Kanto region. And today, we add another one to the list with the Venonat line. Hello, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go over how you would care for and raise different species of Pokemon in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the Pokemon Venonat and its evolution Venomoth. Venonat is a 3-foot-tall, 66-pound bug Pokemon, shaped like a big, round, fuzzy purple ball. It has 2 small hands and feet, 2 white antennas coming off the top of its head, and, most strikingly, 2 large red compound eyes over a mouth with 2 large pincers. When it evolves, it gets taller, at almost 5 feet tall, but also gets a lot lighter, now only being an average of 27.5 pounds. This lighter weight is because it now needs to fly, having a pair of large purple wings. Its center body is segmented into 3 sections, with large eyes and a crest on its head. It now has 6 small white legs that it keeps close to its body, and a striped thorax. In all, it's a major change from when evolving. the two almost looking nothing alike. So let's get into the guide and figure out if these Pokemon could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. One major thing you have to be aware of when talking of this line of Pokemon is that they are very poisonous. I mean, they earn that poison typing. Venonat fur is covered in a poisonous liquid that can be dispersed around itself if it shakes vigorously. Venomoth, much like Butterfree, releases poisonous scales from its wings as it flaps, except that the poison on Venomoth's scales is much more potent than the paralytic on Butterfree's. Both the liquid and the scales can lead to a trip to the doctors or the hospital if you get a large enough dose. So the enclosures for these Pokemon are going to have to take that into consideration. To start with, this is going to be another fully enclosed enclosure, just like the last one we had to do with Paris. I would recommend the same setup, with a greenhouse-like building. The walls can either be fully clear or opaque, so long as you allow the natural light to come inside. Size-wise, you'll be looking at different sizes depending on whether you have a Venonat or a Venomoth. With Venonat, consider something that's about 20 feet by 20 feet, which will provide plenty of space for not only the Pokemon, but also the decorations, which we'll talk about in a second. Venomoth will require a bit more room than its pre-evolution, since it'll need some room to fly around. A 30 by 30 enclosure should be large enough for Venomoth. For Venonat, the height won't really matter, but for Venomoth, you'll need a ceiling height of at least 15 feet. Possibly even more. As for the floor of the enclosure, these aren't actually Pokemon that'll dig, so you can just have the building resting on the grass, allowing for a more natural feel to the enclosure and saving slightly on the expense of getting it built. Now, this also brings us back to the decorations of the interior. These Pokemon usually live in temperate forest regions, places that experience warm summers, cold winters, and both seasons in between. This means that the interior of the enclosure should reflect the ideal of this area. A mild temperature, mild humidity, and a few trees that your Pokemon can climb and live inside. Now, of course that doesn't mean that you're growing full oak and maple trees in your enclosure. There's no way that it's big enough to accommodate even one of those monsters. But what you can do is get fake ones. There are stores online that you can buy fake trees from that'll fit the height of the 15-foot ceiling. They may also be buried in the ground slightly, thus anchoring them and allowing the enclosure to get even closer to the Pokemon's natural habitat. As for the number of trees that you could get, I would think that 3 would be the most comfortable number to go with. Any more and your enclosure may start to feel too cramped for your Pokemon, especially Venomoth with its wings. Also, if you're going to be housing a Venonat, then be sure to get one of the trees with a hole in the side, large enough for the Pokemon to be able to climb into and sleep in. Venonat use these holes in trees as their dens, so if your Pokemon to feel safe and protected inside its enclosure, you're going to need one of the trees to have one. As for Venomoth, they just tend to cling to the trunk or branches of a tree instead of making a nest, so no worries there. Before we move on, there is a few things that we should talk about regarding the structure of the enclosure, and one of them would be the door. Obviously, you're going to need a way to get into the enclosure to clean up after your Pokemon and water the grass inside. But this can't just be some regular door for a few reasons, and both are because of the poison that these Pokemon give off. One is that you'll need a food slot at the bottom of the door. As we'll talk about later on in the guide, this is where you'll be sliding in the food, unless you feel like getting dressed up in a hazmat suit just to feed your Pokemon. As for the second part of the door that makes it non-regular, it's that when the door is closed, you should make sure that it's an airtight seal. By that, I mean you should be sure that none of the poison can get out of the enclosure. With Venonat, it's not really much of a worry, as the poison mist clouds that it can make through shaking don't spread very far. But the scales that come off Venomoth can spread very far, so it's important that you make sure that the entire enclosure, including the door, is airtight and sealed to make sure that the scales can't get out and spread. This is for the safety of you, anyone else nearby the enclosure, or any other Pokemon that could come nearby. To that end, we'll need to install an air filtration system into the enclosure as well. Since it's going to be entirely sealed, this will allow new fresh air to come in, and it'll pull the air that's filled with the poison out and filter it. This has the benefit of keeping the enclosure somewhat clean, allowing for longer breaks between having to go in and clean up the scales. However, this does mean that you'll need to change out the filters and get new ones when they get all gunked up with the scales and poison. When doing this, be sure to have a full body coverage. I'm talking gas masks, gloves, maybe even a full hazmat suit. One can never be too careful when talking about poison. As for other Pokemon that can be housed with these Pokemon, the answer is going to be simple. Only other Venonat evolutions should be housed with them. Thanks to the poison these Pokemon give off, the only ones that'll be totally immune to it would be other members of their own species. I suppose there are some Pokemon that would be fine, like a few of the artificial Pokemon like Magnemite and Voltorb, since they don't breathe or have skin to absorb the poison, but I'm not 100% on that, so I just wouldn't try it. It's best that you just keep it to the Venonat species, and always remember that I only give you the specs for one Pokemon in the enclosure. If you're going to be getting more than one, you'll have to adjust the space of the enclosure accordingly, and add in some more nesting spots for the Venonat. Availability. I'm going to start this right away with you're going to need to get a permit to have one of these Pokemon. Just like the Ekans line, the poison secreted from these Pokemon is very dangerous, and can cause a lot of harm to you or other people in Pokemon if they get out or the poison is not appropriately dealt with. So you'll have to go through some classes, pass some tests, and get the permit before you can even start to look for one of these Pokemon to keep. That's just how it is with a lot of these poison-type Pokemon. Once you have your permit, and the government won't be kicking down your door for illegally keeping a bug on your property, finding one in the wild shouldn't be that hard. Of course, the larger populations are in Kanto, along the eastern route in Safari Zone, and in Johto, at the Lake of Rage in Ilex Forest. However, there are also populations in Paldea and Kalos, along with being rarely spotted in Unova and Sinnoh. Unfortunately, for those of you in the Hoenn, Galar, and Alolan regions, there aren't any wild populations to speak of. So for you, you'll have to travel to a different region to find one. But I'm going to insert my 2 cents here and say that I don't think anyone but highly trained professionals should be going out to catch these Pokemon. Thanks to their highly toxic nature, someone that is unprepared or doesn't know what they're getting themselves into can easily put themselves in a lot of danger. Hunting these Pokemon is not for the average person. So, that brings us to the breeder scene. But that prospect may not be as easy as you think. As you saw in the enclosure section, these Pokemon pretty much poison the air around them. Which means that for someone to not only raise these Pokemon, but attempt to breed them and sell them, that person is going to be taking on a high chance of being poisoned by the very Pokemon they're trying to raise. And it's not the Pokemon's fault, it's just how their biology works. But that does mean that a lot of breeders, myself included, aren't willing to take that risk. Combine that with the fact that you need a permit to even get these Pokemon, and that there won't be a big market of people looking to buy them, and that leads to a major shortage in availability of these Pokemon. So finding a breeder that's willing to sell you these Pokemon is going to be a long process, and when you do find them, then it most likely won't be cheap. No matter what way you go, whether it be a wild Pokemon or a breeder raised one, this is a Pokemon that'll probably be hard for you to get your hands on. Care. Caring for these Pokemon is going to be very hands-off. As I've mentioned multiple times, the level of toxicity that you can get just by being near these Pokemon means that you won't be entering the enclosure to play with them or to hang out with them. I mean, unless you decide to wear a hazmat suit while doing so, which I wouldn't want to do, but you do you. Even if you do go in and hang out in the hazmat suit, these Pokemon aren't exactly the cuddly, snuggly type. For one, they're nocturnal. So if you want to hang out with them, then you'll have to be in there late at night after the sun goes down. And even then, they tend to avoid large creatures like humans, only focused on finding prey. So even if you are in there late at night, in your hazmat suit, sitting still, the most that they're likely to do is to come over and investigate you and then ignore you when you turn out not to be food or a threat. That's the unfortunate reality of a lot of bug-type Pokemon. When it comes to the food situation, these Pokemon are carnivorous, hunting and feeding on smaller bug Pokemon. Mostly this means Caterpie, but they will feed on others like Scatterbug or even Sewaddle. So that does mean that you'll be needing to feed them thawed out meat for their meals. I always recommend Caterpie, but that's just personal preference. Really, any bug meat would do. Just be sure to feed your Venonat 2 cups of food and your Venomoth 2.5 cups. I know it might seem weird to feed your Venomoth more than your Venonat since it weighs less, but it does fly, and thus uses up a lot of energy. When it comes to the amount of feedings, you're going to be giving it to them in one big feeding. In the wild, these Pokemon tend to hunt one prey a night and fill themselves on that prey, leading to them only needing one feeding a night. A good schedule for this then would to have the meat thawed out by dusk and then slide the bowl of food through the slot in the door that I mentioned in the enclosure section. This will have the dual benefit of the food being available right for when your Pokemon wakes up and getting them into a routine of where and when the food will be available. Then, at dawn, when these Pokemon are going to sleep for the day, you retrieve the dish. Unfortunately by entering the enclosure and wash it for the next night. Easy as can be. Since training for these Pokemon is a pointless effort, the last thing we need to go over in this guide is cleaning. You'll have to do the regular stuff like scoop up the waste and care for any of the plants that are in the enclosure. And for Venonat, that's pretty much it. It doesn't make too much of a mess. The issue comes with Venomoth and the scales that it puts out. Those of you who remember the Butterfree guide should remember that part of caring for that Pokemon was the fact that you had to clean up the discarded scales from building up in its enclosure. The same thing happens here, though it can end up being much more deadly. This is why I had you install that air filtration system in this enclosure. It'll help to keep the enclosure cleaner for longer, meaning you get longer breaks between cleanings. But you are still going to have to go in there and clean up the scales that manage to get around the air filter. To that end, you'll need to get fully dressed up in hazmat attire, so that when you're handling the scales, you're safe from their poison. As well, you should have a dedicated vacuum, dustpan, and broom that you use only for this job. That way you don't accidentally start spreading the poison around your own home or something like that. Then, bag up the scales in a biohazard waste bag and dispose of them properly. It's a lot, and exposes you to a lot of risk while you're doing it, which is why for this one I had the filtration system installed. And don't forget to change out and replace those filters. Just like the scales, they should be handled with extreme care and disposed of in biohazard waste bags. Do not take any risks with this stuff, seriously. Cost. Your enclosure is going to be your biggest expense here. Putting together the building, all the decorations, the filtration system, and the specialized door, it's going to probably be custom built. And custom built buildings like this are never cheap, no matter if you're doing it yourself or having a company come in and build it for you. So when you're looking at it as a whole, it's gonna be in the very high category. The Pokemon also won't be cheap. Like I said, thanks to the poisonous nature of these Pokemon, not many breeders out there are even going to have them, and to buy one is going to be a pretty penny because of all the work they have to put into raising and caring for them. Even getting one from the wild isn't going to be cheap, because I highly recommend you hire a professional trainer to go out and catch one for you. It won't be cheap, but it's better than you going out in the woods and getting poisoned with no one else around. Add in the price for the government license to have one, and you're looking at the high, possibly even the very high category. Last is the food, and here you won't have to break the bank for. The Caterpie meat that you'll need is cheap and plentiful. Plus, if you buy in bulk and freeze it, then it can last you longer and usually get it at a better price. In all, for a month of food, you're probably looking at the moderate category, maybe more, maybe less, depending on if you decide to go with a different kind of meat. Conclusion. I'm just going to say it straight out, these Pokemon are really only viable in a zoo setting, because of the toxicity and the ease they have to spread it. I mean, just being near them poses a health risk. I could only recommend these to people that are very, very used to handling dangerous Pokemon. Pure professionals with no small kids, no small Pokemon, and plenty of time and patience to devote to these Pokemon themselves. Venonat and especially Venomoth are not the average person's Pokemon. So if you are that kind of professional, or you own a zoo, then these might be the perfect Pokemon partners for you and you alone. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time when we cover the ground-dwelling Pokemon Diglett and its evolution Dugtrio. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Ground-type Pokemon tend to be large, sturdy Pokemon. Things that look imposing and can shift the ground just by moving. Walking earthquakes and sentient landslides that can shape the landscape just by their passing. Things that aren't allowed near cities because they could cause untold destruction. Pokemon like Garchomp, Steelix, and even the supposed Mac Daddy ground type of them all, Groudon. And then there's Diglett, a head poking out of the ground. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides. Today, we'll be going over the ground mole Pokemon Diglett and its evolution Dugtrio. Diglett itself is a small Pokemon, only sticking 8 inches over the ground and weighing just under 2 pounds. The Pokemon itself is a small brown shape that sticks out of the ground, with 2 small black eyes and a large pink nose. Funny enough, this small stature of the Pokemon makes it the smallest and lightest ground-type Pokemon out there, so that should be nice. And its evolution is 3 Diglets all forming one body. Look, this line is very simple appearance-wise, and honestly, it's pretty simple overall. I mean, sure, they get a bit taller at 2'4" and a lot heavier at 73 pounds, but it's not that big a change when you look at some of the other Pokemon out there. This probably won't be a long and complex guide like the Ekans one. And for those of you wondering, I'm not going to be talking about the Alolan version of these Pokemon in this guide. Like I said in the Pikachu and Rattata guide, I'll be covering those later on. I would say that they're different enough to warrant their own guide, so I'll talk about them when it gets to the rest of the Alola Pokemon far into the future. On that note, we should also mention the Wiglet line from Paldea. While they do share many similarities, and their names are even very similar, they are in no way related to one another. Alolan Diglett and Cantonian Diglett both are descended from the same ancestor, so while being different species, they are related to each other. Wiglet is from a completely different ancestor altogether. It just evolved over the many years to resemble and fill the same ecological niche that Diglett does. So Wiglet and Wugtrio will be when we get to the Paldea region, especially since they're even more different from Diglett than Alolan Diglett is. Enclosure. This Pokemon is going to be a pain to contain, because they need a lot of space, they need to consistently be able to dig, and you need to contain them so they don't just dig off into the sunset and ruin your neighbor's flower bed that they spent 4 months pruning and watering. Which, unfortunately, means that this is going to be a big enclosure. And I mean big. Luckily, it's not actually that complex though. So the basic idea is that you're going to need to build an underground enclosure that has hardened walls that you can then fill with dirt and allow your Pokemon to move around in. Like I said, not terribly complex. You can get companies to come in with industrial equipment and they can dig the hole and line it with a material that is hard enough that even ground Pokemon like Diglett and Dugtrio can't break through the walls. The issue comes with the size, like I said. The problem with the Diglett line is that they continuously keep digging and therefore need a lot of space. In all honesty, the best dimensions that I could find are 165 feet long, 80 feet wide, and a minimum of at least 15 feet deep. You're essentially going to be getting a competition-sized swimming pool and filling it with dirt. Which sounds weird, but hey, it's what you gotta do. On a side note, if you just plan on getting a Diglett and keeping it that way using Everstones, then the enclosure could be half the size. But as most Diglett will evolve into a Dugtrio, I'm just going to go ahead with the larger sized enclosure. As I said, once I guess I'll call it the frame? Once the frame and the walls have been put up, you'll be filling it with dirt. And sure, you could use any old dirt that you wanted to, but there is a way to set the dirt up as to make it best for the Pokemon. The best thing to do with your Pokemon is have layers where there are different kinds of dirt, kind of like those layered cakes you can get at the store. The bottom 2 or 3 feet of the enclosure should be a hard-packed, rocky soil. This will act as a stable base for the enclosure, and also act as a deterrent to the Pokemon from digging too far down. While yes, they could dig through it if they really wanted to, they prefer to dig through less tough material, and so they'll generally avoid this layer. The next layer, which takes up the next 9 or so feet, is going to be a mixture of clay and dirt. This will offer a lot of compactability to this layer, and allow your Pokemon to dig itself a system of warrens and tunnels without having to worry about tunnels collapsing on them too often. As well, the clay in the soil will help keep water from reaching too far down into the enclosure, as, being ground types, they aren't a big fan of water. And then the final layer, the last 2 or so feet to the surface, should be topsoil. Something nice and loose that your Pokemon can stick its head up through and then have the opening collapse behind it once its head goes back underground. This is important as it provides the Pokemon a feeling of safety, like its warren won't be found out so easily by predators. This is also a good thing because too much direct sunlight to this Pokemon is unhealthy, as it can cause their blood to heat up, therefore causing bodily harm. As for other Pokemon that can be housed with the Diglett line, other Diglets are an absolute yes. In the wild, these Pokemon actually live in large colonies. They can do fine on their own, but having more Diglett in your enclosure won't be a bad thing for your Pokemon. You won't even need to expand your enclosure very much if you're just adding in 1 or 2 more Diglett. Though, you might have to expand if you get more than 1 Dugtrio, just a heads up there. On the same point, other ground types are also a good idea, as many of them can get along with each other. However, as I said earlier, a lot of ground types are rather large, so putting them in the enclosure might not be feasible. Things you want to avoid though are grass types, water types, and ice types, as they can cause quite a bit of harm to your Pokemon if they get into a fight with them. As well, electric types might not be a good idea, as ground types can cause them some serious harm. Though, I will say that Diglett tend to be kind of friendly, so if you can find an electric type Pokemon that can be friendly with them back, then it might not be so bad, especially since your ground types like Diglett are immune to the electricity. Either way, always remember to adjust your enclosure to the other Pokemon that you are adding in, as I only ever plan for 1 Pokemon per enclosure. Availability. Despite living in what many can consider large colonies, these Pokemon are another one of those Pokemon that have a very specific area that they live in. Take Kanto, for example. Diglett and Dugtrio only appear in the aptly named Diglett Cave, just outside Vermilion City, a cave system that was dug purely by Diglett evolutions. Now, inside that cave, they are abundant. They're nearly the only Pokemon in there. But strangely enough, outside of that cave, they aren't really anywhere else in the region. And this isn't the only region they do this in. In Sinnoh, they tend to stick to Route 228, though that may be to remain near the warmth coming off of Stark Mountain. And they tend to stay on Route 13 in Kalos, though the reason for that one is more unclear. But oddly enough, in the Galar and Paldea regions, they're quite spread out across multiple areas. This does make me wonder if these Pokemon are originally from one of those regions, but there isn't any evidence of that, so I can't say. The last thing I should mention is that there are rumors and stories of people running into Diglett in Hoenn's Fiery Path, but there aren't any confirmed accounts of that, and they're so scattered that I'm inclined to believe that it's just Pokemon that have been released by other trainers. And as for those of you that live in the Johto or the Unova region, sorry to say, but if you want a wild-caught Diglett or Dugtrio, then you'll have to travel to go get one. As for the breeder industry, I mean, it's not the most common Pokemon to find out there, but it's also not something that I would call rare either. There is actually a whole market for these Pokemon among farmers, as they can be great to till fields and their waste makes great natural fertilizer for crops. Granted, that's not every farmer. Many of them consider Diglett and Dugtrio pests since they eat their crops. But a large community of farmers do like to buy and keep Diglett as working Pokemon. This means, of course, that there are breeders out there that are willing to raise and sell them. So if you want a captive raised Diglett or even a Dugtrio, seeing as how caring for them isn't much different, then you will be able to find one with a bit of work. Care. As many farmers can attest, these Pokemon are voracious vegetarians. They will gladly eat any crop that they can get to underground, leading to a bit of tension between some farmers in the Diglett line. But that also makes it easy to figure out what to feed them. They can really eat anything, but the best mixture for these Pokemon is a majority of vegetables. This means things like lettuce, onions, and peppers would be best for them. You don't even need to slice them at all either, as these Pokemon are very much able to bite through the tougher and more fibrous parts of these foods, though it will help with the measuring of the food if you do decide to cut them up. As for the amount, you'll be giving Diglett a total of 1/3 of a cup of food a day, spaced out between a morning and nighttime meal. This might seem like a lot of food for a Pokemon that isn't even a foot tall and is just over 1.5 pounds in weight, but you have to realize that these Pokemon only really stop moving and digging when they sleep. There are very few times that they stop moving while awake, meaning that they burn a lot of energy and calories through their day. When it comes to Dugtrio, they get a significant increase in size, and with that increase in size comes an equal increase in food. Dugtrio gets a massive 3 cups of food a day, still split between a morning and evening meal. They still get the same mix of veggies, just an increased amount. The only thing that we have left to talk about is how to feed them. The issue is that they live underground, meaning that just placing the food on the ground in the enclosure in a dish won't do anything. So your two options are to feed them directly, which we'll talk about in a bit, or you can bury the food around the enclosure. I know that might sound strange, I just told you to bury your Pokemon's food underground, but you have to remember that this is how they normally get their food. Those big red noses on their face aren't just for show, as they can smell food through feet of dirt, meaning that if you bury your food, they will still be able to smell it and track it down. You can even use this as a sort of enrichment for your Pokemon, burying its food in a few random spots so that it needs to work out its brain and sense of smell to be able to find it. When talking about interactions with these Pokemon, it's gonna be very limited. And that's not because of the Pokemon themselves, they actually tend to be very friendly. The issue comes with how they live. This Pokemon line tends to spend the majority of their time underground, only coming up for 1 or 2 short periods throughout the day. And I can't really give you a set time for when that is. These Pokemon don't have a biological clock or a timer to be at the surface at a given time of a day. Realistically, they don't need to surface at all, but many still do at random points throughout the day. Your goal, when you first get these Pokemon, is going to be to study them and figure out what the individual Pokemon's pattern is that you have. Some Diglett evolutions will like to surface in the morning, some will surface at night, some maybe even surface exactly at noon. It really depends on the Pokemon individual itself. So when you first get the Pokemon, keep an eye on it and study it. It may take a few weeks for it to get used to being in the new enclosure, but eventually they will settle into a groove that you'll be able to keep track of. Once you notice its pattern, then your socialization begins. Start by just being in the area when your Pokemon comes above surface. When they do, if you've got a wild caught one, then they may be nervous around you. Try to speak to it gently in a nice gentle tone, and slowly approach it in a non-threatening way. If it starts to retreat underground, stay still, but continue to try and soothe it. As well, take a portion of its next meal and offer it to it in your hand, showing that you don't mean it harm and are willing to share food with it. It might not be willing to get close right away, and that's okay. If, after about 10 minutes, it doesn't come closer, then let it be. You don't want to stress the Pokemon out too much after all. Continue to try every day, and don't get discouraged because it may take some time. But over time, your Pokemon should warm to your presence, recognizing you as a friendly person and that you don't mean it harm. Once it allows you close enough to eat from your hand and to allow you to reach out and touch it, then you've pretty much solidified your relationship with it. You should still be careful not to startle it too badly through sudden movements and loud noises, as that can set your relationship back a few steps. But by this point, it should trust you enough to forgive a few mistakes. After that, you should be able to feed your Pokemon by hand if you don't feel like burying it for its next meal. And when your Pokemon does come to the surface, if you're nearby, they will at least come over and greet you. Unfortunately, that is usually the majority that you can do with these Pokemon. Also, I should mention that if you get a breeder-raised one, then this step is going to be mostly completely unnecessary, as a breeder-raised Pokemon tends to be more used to people. The last thing I want to talk about with these Pokemon is the cleaning, and more specifically, the health of the soil that they live in. Luckily, it won't be like with Oddish, where you need to consistently keep the soil at a certain pH level or spread fertilizer to re-energize the nutrients in the soil. In fact, you most likely will need to do the opposite. The waste that these Pokemon produce is naturally packed with nutrients and breaks down quickly, acting as a great fertilizer. And they are mostly underground, which does come with added benefit that you don't need to clean up after them very often. However, this added fertilizer waste is going to make any grass that grows on the surface of the enclosure grow much, much faster than the rest of your lawn. For the comfort of your Pokemon and the ease of access for you into the enclosure, you should keep this grass cut very short, meaning you'll have to mow it probably once a week, if not more. As well, you may have noticed that I haven't mentioned a water dish or anything of the like. That's because these Pokemon get most of their water from 2 sources. One is their food, from things like lettuce that are mostly water content. But the other major way that they get their water content is through groundwater. As I mentioned, a good layer of the enclosure should be a nice clay and soil mix, not allowing very much water to penetrate very far into the enclosure. But they do come up to the top layer for the groundwater that has penetrated the topsoil layer. This means that you need to make sure that the water that comes through is clean. So you need to avoid any kind of chemicals or pesticides that could get absorbed by the water and brought down into the ground. It can very quickly lead to your Pokemon getting very sick and needing a trip to the Pokemon Center. And nobody is happy when you need to make an emergency trip to the Pokemon Center. Cost. Food is going to be easy to get a hold of. It's just common veggies that you can buy at the supermarket or farmer's market nearby, or you can even grow them yourself. If you get them from the store, then they will probably cost you in the low category, or possibly the moderate one depending on how much you buy. Just be sure to wash them before you feed them to your Pokemon, as you're never sure what kind of chemicals were used in its growth. If you decide to grow them yourselves, then it might even bring this cost down to the very low category, though it will take you more time and energy on your part. The Pokemon itself won't be too much either. Diglett will be sitting squarely in the low end of the moderate category, mostly because they're so easy to raise together in the same enclosure that having one isn't that different from having a dozen. When it comes to Dugtrio, the price will shoot up to the high end of the moderate category, or possibly even into the high category itself. This is mostly because you can't house as many of them together without needing to expand the enclosure, and they cost a bunch more in food care. Unfortunately, the enclosure is going to be the part that will break the bank. We're talking thousands of dollars to put in this enclosure. You will need to hire a company to come in with heavy-duty excavating equipment and Pokemon, and tons of concrete to line the sides. Then you'll need to buy the correct soil and fill the enclosure with it. So yeah, needless to say that you're going to be deep into the very high category for this. Conclusion. These would be great pets to have if it wasn't for the enclosure cost. They're friendly, easy to care for, and even kind of cute. Even Dugtrio, I would say that they could end up being great family pets. But the enclosure cost is so prohibitive to so many people. You need land and money to own these Pokemon. And so many people for whom a Diglett or Dugtrio would be amazing just can't do it. If it weren't for that, then I would say that these could easily be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the feline Pokemon Meowth and its evolution into the large cat Pokemon Persian. Have a wonderful night, everyone.